The summer offensive launched by Ukraine against Russia continues with fierce clashes. The Ukrainian armed forces are on the road to victory with small but determined steps. The current goal of Kiev leader Zelensky is to seize the advantage on the southern front lines. If the Ukrainian forces seize the advantage on the southern front line and fully regroup the southern axis, it will be much easier to focus on the Crimea. For this reason, while the trench wars in Zaporizhia continued, Ukrainian river troops took action on the Dnieper River to provide support to this region. This breakthrough of the Ukrainian troops was reflected in the video footage. Russia's response to Ukraine's moves on the Moscow-controlled left bank of the Dnieper River is allegedly shown in a video. The undated clip from the Noel Reports outlet covering the war in Ukraine comes amid growing concerns in Russia about the ability of Ukrainian troops to cross the river in the Kherson region. Aerial images taken from different angles show the explosions on the side of the bridge. It is reported that Ukrainian forces deployed troops near the Antonivsky Bridge, which was destroyed on June 23, where Russian troops struggled to drive them away. The clip was originally posted by the Telegram account to Dniprovsky Rubej. The clip showed how at 14:30 an airstrike was carried out on the 124th Territorial Defense Brigade on the northern outskirts of Antonovsky Island. The Telegram account added that the targets were hit. Pro-Russian mill bloggers said that Ukrainian troops captured the village of Daki, opposite the city of Kherson. Mill bloggers stated that Russia is calling for more ships to the Dnieper power group to stop the advance of Russia in Kiev. Last week, Russia's appointed Kherson Governor Vladimir Saldo posted a video on Telegram that he claimed showed Russian forces launching an Iskander short-range ballistic missile at the bridge where Ukrainian forces had taken refuge. Vladimir Saldo. Moscow insisted that his troops repulsed the Ukrainian forces. It is believed that the actions of the Ukrainian forces on the riverbank were part of an attempt to prevent the redeployment of Russian troops to the front in Zaporizhia. Zeev Feintuk, senior intelligence analyst at security firm Global Guardian, said Ukraine's landings on the other side of the Dnieper were essentially a success, but were part of a first step, not necessarily a giant leap. Feintuk said that they will help facilitate attacks on Oleshki, a town that Ukrainian forces must secure in order to advance further in this direction. The idea is more of a shaping operation and less of an immediate indication foreshadowing a large-scale cross-river. Ukraine will eventually have to land in heavy armor, including tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, to make an impact in southern Kherson. The en masse landing of Ukrainian forces in Kherson would be a turning point. This is because such a move could bind up the Zaporizhia front or some Russian forces that may have reinforced other fronts. In addition, in the last days of June, Ukraine's Dnipro boat landing group, to which the USA invested approximately $500 million, started a midnight operation into Dnipro to turn the clashes in Zaporizhia in favor of Kiev and to control the situation on the southern front lines, including Kherson. A dozen boats from the Dauntless Sea Ark patrol group participated in the operation. 62 coastal and river patrol boats are actively working in this boat group of Ukraine. In this particular operation, the lightly armored U.S.-donated Dauntless Ark patrol boat relied on its speed to evade attacks. This boat's impressive maneuverability was an important asset to Ukraine's recently formed river fleet. In addition, this boat was a distraction for any Russian boat or naval force they might encounter on the Dnipro. The main goal of Ukraine's Dnipro boat landing forces was to reach the Crimean Peninsula via Kherson and liberate the peninsula from Russian control. For this purpose, the boats of the Ukrainian forces advanced at maximum speed in the direction of Kherson of the Dnipro River. After a certain time, the Ukrainian landing boats were navigating their course on the Kherson side of the Dnipro River and encountered the boat group of the Russian naval forces. Ukrainian landing boats were moving in a direction close to the coastal part of this water area. While Russian boats were mostly in the middle of the river, Russian boats were almost open targets in the direction of the Dnipro Kherson. Since the speed of the Russian boats was slow compared to the Ukrainian landing boats, it was inevitable that both sides would encounter each other. Ukraine's boats allowed the Russian boats sailing off Dnipro to progress a little further on their course. The reason for this emerged after a certain period of time with the advance of the Russian boats on the Dnipro Kherson Isthmus. It was ensured that the Ukrainian artillery on the coast took these Russian boats into range. The Ukrainians used this tactic to target Russian boats from both the coastal areas and the coast. Simultaneously, the Ukrainian landing forces following the Russian boats from the coastline accompanied the artillery attacks. The Russian boats were badly damaged and had to retreat. So what is the latest status of the ground equipment of the Russian army? Kiev troops are reporting notable local successes as they continue their massive counterattack at multiple points along the 800-mile front. He claimed there was a significant increase in Russian artillery destroyed as Ukraine continued its counteroffensive. The latest Russian casualties, detailed by the Ukrainian military, claimed 36 artillery systems were destroyed in 24 hours. The Ukrainian army put the total destroyed parts since February 2022 to 4,288. Wednesday's figures also claim that one additional Russian air defense system, 3 tanks, 9 armored combat vehicles, and 670 Russian personnel were destroyed. For example, an M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle hit a Russian tank with an anti-tank missile system in the Zaporizhia region. A video of the destruction of an enemy combat vehicle was shared on social media. Delivered to the 47th Mechanized Brigade, Bradley Magura has been actively used on the front since June. In the video, the gunner of the infantry fighting vehicle shows a Russian tank detected by thermal imaging and the flight path of a guided anti-tank missile that hit it. The transferred M2A2 Bradley is equipped with the TOW-2 anti-tank missile system, which can hit heavily armored targets at a distance of 3,750 meters alongside IF's. BGM-71 TOW anti-tank missiles were allegedly delivered to Ukraine. Another video produced by the military shows the Bushmaster M240 25mm automatic cannon being used on an unknown Russian combat vehicle and subsequently destroyed at 27 seconds of the video. The enemy target explodes, possibly as a result of the destruction of the ammunition. According to the military, IFs repeatedly withstood the explosion of anti-tank mines and left their crews unharmed. In addition, the combat vehicle once withstood a direct hit from an anti-tank ammunition accumulated in the turret. On the other hand, Kiev claimed to have eliminated more than 230,000 Russian soldiers since February 2022. Ukrainian troops continue their attacks in various parts of the front line. This pressure is widely interpreted by observers as an effort to flex and weaken the Russian army before it delivers a heavily armored punch at an as yet unspecified location. Broader attacks began in early June after several weeks of forming operations consisting of deep attacks against Russian command supply and infrastructure targets. The outcome of the operation could be crucial, as President Volodymyr Zelensky is under pressure from Western partners to achieve results. After tens of billions of dollars in foreign aid and months of heavy weapons deliveries, last month, Zelensky admitted that the counterattack was progressing more slowly than intended, but he and his senior commanders have repeatedly scolded Western officials and the media for setting expectations too high and giving Kiev troops little time to achieve their goals. The commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, Colonel General Oleksandr Kursky, stated that the counterattack was proceeding according to the prepared and approved plans. General Oleksandr Tarnovsky, who led the operation in the south of the country, reported that his forces had not yet reached their full potential. Kiev's gains include areas flanking the devastated eastern city of Bakhmut and an important bridgehead on the Dnieper River. It is only a matter of time before the Ukrainian forces add a new one to these successes. Putin has made an unprecedented move toward the generals he believes will depose him. Putin's personal archives have been made public. The army's position in Russia has fundamentally changed as a result of this move. Putin, who has declared a state of emergency, has also been linked to the deaths of numerous opposition oligarchs. Putin chose to plan a highly significant operation in Russia's domestic affairs during the combative days of the Russian-Ukraine war, not because of his successive failures. Putin, who made this decision in response to widespread dissatisfaction with his recent failed administration, felt he was in a bind. His decision to thwart a coup by the generals following calls for revolt from numerous locations stunned the entire world. The Russian army has a structure that dates back to the Soviet Union, when it was the world's second most powerful army. But like every mismanaged army, although having the required strength on its own, is unable of taking even the smallest step in the fight is unable of taking even the smallest step in the fight. The fact that Ukrainian soldiers battle with higher organizational skills and morale provides them a significant advantage over the Russian army. Despite this advantage, Putin is still planning many more operations that will send Russian men to their deaths. This position, on the other hand, began to enrage the army's generals who want Putin's power to alter, notwithstanding his failures in many economic and sociological areas have already taken action and major problems have emerged in the Kremlin. When the Kremlin issued a red warning, it turned out that Putin and the generals on his side were drafting new plans. However, the idea of a coup was not novel. It was only recently that things began to deteriorate in Russia as a whole. There are no institutions or organizations that have not been impacted by Putin's mismanagement. However, a large number of protesters have begun to take to the streets. Putin retaliated by mobilizing his national army, often known as his personal army, because he distrusts the military. This army of 340,000 people was unleashed on the populace and protests were brutally suppressed, too. Immediately following this incident, voices from the army began to rise in protest because the security of those people was overlooked. These cries were heard just at the start of the First World War. However, Putin has modified the duty zones, declaring that all of those generals will be transferred to a more democratic administration. Putin devised a devilish scheme to halt all possible institutions within the army. Generals who might rebel against him were at the heart of this plot. Putin had to mark all soldiers who resisted him and his policies. The archives confirmed that these soldiers were going to be slain in preparation for the slightest coup against him. Putin's plans for this troop were far more fluid when Russia launched a heated conflict such as the Ukrainian conflict. As a result, Russia has lost a considerable number of generals since the start of the war. One of the key reasons Russia had a high military level was that it provided excellent training to its rank-and-file soldiers. It was extremely beneficial to the Russian army, especially when retired generals were raised in accordance with Soviet military norms. They also had free will, which allowed them to rebel against an undemocratic government based on their thoughts. This predicament compelled Putin to choose between escalating his deception in the conflict and retaining power. Putin, of course, chose power in order to avoid being tried later, and the KGB then initiated a very serious operation involving rank-and-file soldiers. Putin invited retired generals and others with significant power to the assignment one by one. While this situation surprised people all across the world, at first it was projected that he would profit from his experience. But nothing ever goes as planned, according to the archives. These generals were expressly deployed to the front lines of the heated war by Putin. A journalist named Dmitry, who was attempting to expose them in the Russian press at the time, was found dead the next morning at his house. Major General Konomi Beresheva was one of the first victims of Putin's diabolical agenda. Bochev, who achieved great success in the Russian Air Force, retired from the Russian army 10 years ago. Following his retirement, he was one of the generals called to duty when the war began, but no one could have imagined that he would die so quickly. But it was probable that Putin wanted to get rid of it because it was referenced in archive papers and Russia had faced major difficulties during the Ukrainian war. To avoid drawing the attention of the generals, Putin had to come up with an alternative cover. He perished in this manner on the front lines of the battle. It is also required to create some information on this. Despite the fact that there were numerous wars up until 2014, only one general was killed. In other words, this is not a mistake to make in this conflict, especially with an army like Russia's, which is touted as the world's second largest. This validates the information provided by the archives when they first emerge. Immediately following this incident, Major General Andrei Mordovich, Putin's right-hand man, was shot and killed by a sniper. The fact that such important generals were killed one by one demonstrated once again that Putin was working on a serious plan. The truly shocking charge, however, was made in reference to Sergei Surovikin, the former commander of the Ukrainian front. Sergei Surovikin, the commander, was promptly fired. The reason for this is because, while it is expressed as Russia's failed attacks following each other, the problem was completely different. Retired generals and active duty figures who intended to stage a coup in Russia joined up with Sergei Surovikin to form a coup team. The only reason Sergei Surovikin could not be executed was because to Wagner, the Russian army's most useful group in active warfare. At the time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of Wagner, has often stood next to Sergei Surovikin. Surovikin, who is nearly untouchable under his protection, could make whatever moves he wanted and was now establishing his own dominance inside the army. This infuriated Putin. Putin quickly picked Valery Gerasimov, his chief of staff, whom he greatly trusts, to replace him. However, the other generals were killed because they did not want Putin. It was widely known that the generals planning the coup sought to usher in a completely new regime in Russia. The president would be replaced, and as expected, Prigozhin, viewed as a challenger to Putin, would take the helm. Putin, who was aware of this, could not keep his voice quiet because he was currently winning one or two fronts thanks to Prigozhin's army. However, it was already disclosed through the archives that he assassinated highly powerful oligarchs in order to put sanctions on Europe. Approximately 11 oligarchs died as a result of simple accidents and unexplained reasons. These were the names that possessed the most natural gas and oil in Russia, in addition to being the richest names in Russia. They have, however, earned Putin's wrath by resisting Russia's recent, unpredictable breakthroughs. This has recently demonstrated how much Putin supports an anti-democratic type of government. It makes no difference if you are a high-ranking Russian official, if you are not a Putin admirer, but if Putin believes in you, he can promote even the most ordinary citizen to the highest levels of power. The Russian people who are aware of the situation now want to be managed by meritocratic leaders. This internal disarray is expected to worsen with Putin's departure. It is one of the ideas that the war will change in every way after Putin goes. Your Kremlin is in disarray. The Russian army was brought to an end due to a lack of Russian intelligence, and the surprise offensive of the Ukrainian army resulted in the departure of the Russian army and the admission of two high-ranking officials known as Putin's most faithful men into each other. With a new army of 10,000 soldiers, the Ukrainian army is pushing on Kharkiv. The massive onslaught launched by the Ukrainian army on Kharkiv made life difficult for the occupying Russian forces. The Ukrainian army has expanded weapons shipments to the cities of Izium and Kupiansk, which it has just liberated from Russian domination. Although Russian forces assume that these military shipments were for the city of Soledar, Ukraine's main purpose was to recover Kharkiv. The Ukrainian army has begun marching towards Kharkiv with tanks, armored vehicles, and a new army of 10,000 people amassed in the cities of Izium and Kupiansk. In recent months, the Ukrainian army was able to retake the captured cities of Izium and Kupiansk, and it announced that its next target was Kharkiv. It is planned to expel the occupying Russian troops from Kharkiv in conjunction with the massive onslaught conducted by the Ukrainian army. The war between Ukraine and Russia continues to escalate while the Russian army retreats more and more in Bakhmut. It can only defend in the south. However, Russia's missile terror still continues. The other day it bombed the settlements in and around Kiev again. Unfortunately, the Kh-22 cruise missiles used by the Russians cannot be shot down by the Ukrainian air defense systems. For this reason, many civilian casualties were reported. On the other hand, the Russian army is on the verge of complete collapse. Russian soldiers do not want to be a victim of a long and aimless war. For them, the 11-month war has no psychological motivation. There is only death. For this reason, instead of dying, Russian soldiers try harder to escape from the front, attack their commanders and comrades, and rebel. In fact, Russian soldiers are taking these actions before they even go to the Ukrainian front. In the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's confusion in the army never ends. Russia caused great repercussions when it changed the name of the head of its army close to the anniversary of the war. The Kremlin announced the other day that General Gerasimov had assumed command of Russian forces in Ukraine, which was interpreted as the fall of General Sergei Surovikin, who stepped into the wall just 3 months ago. On the other hand, in the statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense regarding the change of duty, it was stated that the appointment of General Gerasimov was made for the different elements within the armed forces to act more organized and effectively. Some experts considered the reshuffle as a sign that Surovikin may have gained too much power. The appointment made the other day is also evaluated together with the ongoing fierce clashes in Soledar, the Russian mercenary company. The Wagner Group claimed that its forces had taken control of the city after Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the group, shared this claim. On Tuesday, a statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense was made that did not confirm. Experts explain this situation by saying that elements such as Chechens who participated in the war in Ukraine, Wagner Group, and militias in Donbass are trying to stand out in different ways. It looks like Prigozhin, leader of Wagner Group, will continue to use his successes in solidarity in Bakhmut to promote his group as only force capable of achieving tangible gains in Ukraine. In addition, experts underline that General Gerasimov, who was brought to in charge of the Ukrainian forces, and Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group who allegedly covets Putin's seat, do not get along well. Russia has seen setbacks in Ukraine since its invasion, which is approaching a year, including losing control of Kherson, the only regional capital it has captured in the south. Capturing Soledar is stated to be a victory for the Kremlin both militarily and propaganda. Like to be presented to critics within Russia, although it gains a relatively small and costly. Clashes around Bakhmut have been going on for months. As a matter of fact, despite the long and intense war for Russia, neither Soledar nor Bakhmut has any special operational importance. It's just a show of strength that Russia is trying to prove to the world that its army is capable of winning. On the other hand, during the Russian attacks on Ukraine, a huge explosion occurred in the city of Belgorod, where the most ammunition was shipped for the Russian army at night. While there was great fear in the city due to the explosion in the warehouse belonging to the Russian army, the violence of the explosion was felt intensely, both in the city and in Ukraine. While it was learned that the teams of the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russia, as well as the teams of the Russian Ministry of Defense, made great efforts to extinguish the fire. It was announced that the fire continued with the explosions in the Belgorod region of Russia. A Russian sergeant is shaken by the news of blowing up 13 soldiers with a grenade. A soldier from the Sverdlovsk region on the territory of a military unit in the Bryansk region deliberately detonated an RGD-5 grenade, blowing up his colleagues as a result of the explosion. 3 soldiers died and 10 others received various wounds and injuries, according to the information received by our news service. A tragic and at the same time mysterious event has occurred. The Russian soldier took a grenade and, thus trying to gain credibility among his colleagues, then threw a grenade under his feet and staged an explosion. It was reported that there were mobilized citizens in the building. It is not yet known how exactly the soldier will gain access to the grenade. According to Russian state media, the incident is believed to be caused by the careless handling of ammunition by Russian troops called to fight in Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine revealed many flaws among Putin's troops, including the inability to protect the well-trained, motivated ones. These weaknesses, combined with Kiev's stronger-than-expected defense efforts backed by Western military aid, have blunted Putin's military gains, allowing Ukraine to retake thousands of square kilometers of previously occupied territory. In the final blow to Putin's army, at least 3 soldiers were killed during an explosion at the Tonko farm in Russia's Belgorod region, according to a report by Russian state media. Russian authorities have made few details about the incident public, but early investigations are willing to believe that soldiers point to misuse of ammunition as the cause of the explosion. It was also stated that ammunition was detonated in a nearby warehouse during the explosion, but it is not yet known how much or what kind of ammunition was destroyed during the explosion. A criminal investigation was launched into the explosion. The explosion was the last military action to rock Belgorod near the Ukrainian border this week. Russia is officially resisting to continue fighting in Ukraine despite struggles over the acquisition of military equipment, shortages of manpower, poor morale among troops, and many failed administrations, as some predict, an internal division within military leaders. While Russian forces appear to have made some small progress in the Ukrainian city of Soledar, Ukrainian army leaders still have control over the situation on the western outskirts of the city, north of Bakhmut. Putin's sweeping defeat in Ukraine is dragging his country towards a civil war. The meaning of millions of losses in Russia indicates that civil war is coming. Meanwhile, warnings of a civil war erupting in Moscow had previously been issued by some critics of Russian leader President Putin. We can say that will be the end of Putin largely depends on how this war will end. For now, perhaps the only thing that can be done is for the elites in Russia to make up their minds and choose a replacement for Putin. It will be easiest for them to choose a replacement who can negotiate with the West, provide some initial framework to finalize the logistics of this war, and then work towards future elections. Russian elites regularly expressed their disappointment and discontent with the ongoing war in Ukraine, anticipating civil turmoil and conflict in Moscow and an inevitable civil war. They fear that the country will soon descend into the abyss of terrorism as people become more and more weary of the war. It seems quite likely that Moscow could turn into a civil war with millions of casualties, complete collapse, and unification. The same cannot be said for Ukraine war. Although for more than 20 years, Putin has earned a reputation as invincible among the Russian elite for always managing to get himself out of the hardest stops at times. Russia's losses in Ukraine are seen as one of the most embarrassing defeats of the war for the Russian military. We can say that we are about to realize that Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, which is stuck in the territory of Ukraine, was a big mistake.